A little afternoon on the 16th of November, 1944, the lead companies of the 22nd Infantry Regiment waded across a cold stream, the Maps, called the Reterre, and began climbing into the Hürtgen forest. It had been raining for days. The fir trees stood close and black and tall enough to swallow most of the light, and somewhere in the gloom ahead, men of the German 275th Infantry Division waited in foxholes roofed with logs and in bunkers the Americans would not see until they were nearly on top of them. The regiment had eaten a hot breakfast that morning. For most of the men climbing into those trees, it would be the last hot meal for 18 days. Their commander was a wiry, graying West Pointer named Charles Lanham, a man of 42 who led from the front and expected the same from everyone under him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. What happened to that regiment over the next 18 days is, on its face, a simple horror story. Each of its rifle companies went into the forest with an average of about 162 men. 7 days later, the average rifle company was down to 87. Inside the first 3 days, the regiment lost all 3 of its battalion commanders. By the end of the 6th day, the 22nd had passed 50% casualties, and 50% is a line military men draw with some care. It is the point at which a unit is generally considered to have lost most of its fighting power, the number at which a sensible army pulls what remains out of the line to rest and rebuild. The 22nd was not pulled out. It kept attacking for 12 more days. When it was finally relieved, it had suffered something close to 2,800 casualties, around 86% of its full strength, to take one shattered village and about 6,000 yards of trees. By the Army's own reckoning, 1 man fell for every 2 yards gained. Now hold that picture against the way the German Army understood war, because the gap between the two is the whole of this story. The German soldier knew exactly what a rifle company at half strength looked like. He had seen it on many fronts. It looked like a unit that had stopped being a unit. It looked like frightened survivors go to ground, waiting for orders that were not coming, waiting for a leader who was already dead in the mud somewhere behind them. A force bled down to half its men was, by everything the German army had learned in a century of hard soldiering, a force that stops. These did not stop, and in command posts behind the line, German officers kept running into the same difficulty, the same problem they could not solve with the tools their army had handed them. They knew how to break an enemy. You found the heart of him, and you killed it. You found the machine gun, and you silenced it. You found the officer, and you removed him, and the thing in front of you came apart in your hands. They did all of that to the Americans in the Hürtgen over and over, and the Americans kept coming. A company that had lost half its men, most of its sergeants, and every officer at start of the day, which should not have been able to mount a coordinated attack by nightfall. These companies did. That was not a question of courage. The Germans had faced brave men everywhere, on every front, and bravery had never been a mystery to them. This was a question of how the thing was built, and the answer is not the one most people reach for. We have to begin with an uncomfortable fact because this is not the place for the flattering version, and the truth here is far more interesting than the flattery. Man for man, the German soldier was very probably the better soldier. That is not opinion dressed up as history. After the war, an American officer named Trevor Dupuy, a West Point graduate and an artilleryman who spent the rest of his life building mathematical models of combat, went through the records of dozens of engagements between German and Western forces. His conclusion was blunt, and it has unsettled people ever since. On a man-for-man basis, he found German ground soldiers consistently inflicted casualties at about a 50% higher rate than they suffered from the British and American troops facing them. And he stressed that this held under all circumstances. It held when the Germans were attacking and when they were defending, when they outnumbered the enemy and when they were outnumbered themselves, when they had control of the air and when the sky belonged to the other side, when they won and when they lost. Roughly speaking, by his arithmetic, it took something like 120 Allied soldiers to do the work of 100 Germans. Later analysts have argued the exact figure down somewhat, but not the direction of it. The shape of the finding stands. So set aside, right now, any idea that the answer is simply that the Americans were tougher or fought harder. They did not, on average, fight harder than the men they were facing, which only sharpens the puzzle. If the individual German was the more dangerous animal, then an American company at 50% going up against that should have been doubly doomed. It was not. The reason has very little to do with the men as men, and almost everything to do with two pieces of design the two armies had quietly settled on years before the Hurtgen, in peacetime, in manuals most soldiers never read. One was about where a squad keeps its firepower. The other was about where a unit keeps its leadership. Get those two things right, and a unit does not die when you cut it in half. It bends. Get them wrong, and the same wound is fatal. The Germans had gotten one of them, the leadership one, gloriously right, and they had built their entire reputation on it. But on the matter of firepower, the two armies had made opposite choices, and that is where we have to start, because it is the simpler of the two, and it cuts the deepest. Picture a German infantry squad at the start of the war. They called it a Gruppe, and it ran to about 10 men. There was a squad leader, a non-commissioned officer, and a deputy beneath him. There was a three-man machine gun team, a gunner, a man to feed and load and tend the weapon, and a man to carry ammunition. And there were 5 riflemen. Now here is the thing that matters, the thing written into German doctrine and inherited straight from the army of the First World War. In that squad, the machine gun was not a supporting weapon. The machine gun was the weapon. It was the thing that did the killing. Everything else in the squad existed to serve it. The riflemen were not there to win the firefight with their rifles. They were there to carry belts of ammunition for the gun, to protect the gun, to find good ground for the gun, to keep the gun firing. The German army had decided, with great clarity and a fair amount of genius, that the squad's reason for existing was to deliver the fire of one excellent machine gun. And the gun was excellent. The Germans built the first true general-purpose machine guns the world had seen, the MG-34, and then the cheaper, faster MG-42, weapons so good that their basic design still serves in armies today. The MG-42 could fire something on the order of 1,200 rounds a minute, a rate so high it did not sound like individual shots at all. It sounded like tearing cloth, like a zipper, like a saw. Allied soldiers gave it grim nicknames. The Germans gave it a 6-man crew when they could, and they built their whole tactical picture around the cone of fire it could throw. When American infantry walked into ground covered by one of these guns, very often the most they could do was press themselves flat and wait. Wait for the barrel to overheat and need changing, wait for the belt to run out, wait for a tank to come up and blast the position apart. The German squad, built around that gun, was a magnificent instrument for killing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Now picture the American squad that was being designed in the same years, an ocean away, by men who had reached the opposite conclusion. The United States Army Rifle Squad of 1944 had 12 men in it. On paper, it looked similar enough. There was a squad leader, a staff sergeant, and an assistant squad leader, a sergeant. There was an automatic rifleman who carried the Browning automatic rifle, with an assistant and an ammunition bearer to keep him fed. And there were the riflemen, 7 of them, 2 of whom were designated as scouts. Glance at it, and you might think it was the same idea as the German squad, a support weapon and some men around it. It was not the same idea at all. It was the reverse. In the American manuals, the automatic weapon was a supplement to the fire of the rifleman. Read that the other way around from the German doctrine, because that is exactly how it sat. The Germans had riflemen supplementing the machine gun. The Americans had the automatic weapon supplementing the rifles. The British, for what it is worth, had organized themselves much the way the Germans had, around their own light machine gun. The Americans were the outlier. They had decided that the heart of the squad was not a single crew-served weapon, but the riflemen themselves, all of them, each one a source of fire in his own right. And that decision only made any sense at all, because of the rifle they put in those men's hands. It was called the M1, the Garand, and it was the first semi-automatic rifle ever issued in large numbers to the infantry of any nation on Earth. Every other major army went into the war with bolt-action rifles, weapons where the soldier had to work a bolt by hand after every single shot, breaking his aim, slowing his rate of fire to a handful of aimed rounds a minute. The German Mauser, the famous Kar 98, was a bolt-action rifle that fed from a 5-round magazine. The Garand was different in kind, not just degree. It loaded 8 rounds on a clip, and it cycled itself. The soldier pulled the trigger, the rifle did the rest, and he pulled the trigger again. A War Department training film of the era put the difference plainly to the men learning the weapon. One man firing a Garand, it told them, could do very nearly as much damage as 3 men with the old bolt-action Springfield. General Patton, who was not a sentimental man about equipment, called the M1 the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he wrote it down in a letter in late January of 1945. Sit with what that meant at the level of the squad, because this is the quiet hinge the entire war seems to turn on. In a German squad of 10, the killing fire came overwhelmingly from one place, the machine gun. Take away those 3 men, take away that one gun, and you had 7 men with bolt-action rifles, brave and well-trained, and suddenly able to produce only a fraction of the fire they had a moment before. The squad's power was concentrated, and anything concentrated can be cut out with a single clean stroke. In an American squad of 12, the killing fire came from everywhere. It came from 11 semi-automatic rifles and 1 automatic rifle. 11 men, any one of whom could pour out fire that a bolt-action soldier simply could not match. The power was spread across the whole body of the squad. There was no single throat to cut. I want to be honest about the limits of this, because the easy version oversells it and the truth does not need the help. At the level of the individual man, the American had the firepower advantage, clearly and decisively. But the German machine gun was so good, and German doctrine used it so well, that across a whole platoon or company the books came closer to balancing than the rifle comparison alone would suggest. A single MG 42 in good position could dominate a piece of ground in a way no number of Garands quite equaled. The American edge was real, but it was an edge, not a magic trick. It did not make the German squad weak. The German squad was not weak. What it did was something subtler and, in the long grind of a battle like the Hurtgen, far more important. It changed what happened to each squad when the killing started and the men began to fall. Because that is the real test of any machine, and it is the test the Germans were about to apply to the Americans without meaning to. Not how the thing runs when it is whole and gleaming and at full strength. Anyone can field a strong squad on a parade ground. The test is what is left when you take the machine apart under fire, when you tear pieces out of it in the dark and the rain, when half of it is dead or screaming or gone. One of these 2 designs degraded gracefully when it was broken, and went on functioning with what remained. The other had a single point of failure, and when that point failed, the rest tended to fail with it. The German army was about to spend 18 days in a forest discovering which was which, and it would not like the answer. But the firepower was only the first half of it. To understand why those American companies could still attack after losing half their men and all their officers, we have to look at the second piece of the design, the one about leadership, and there the irony becomes almost unbearable because it was an idea the Germans themselves had invented. The idea was not American in origin. The Germans had thought of it first, and for a long time they had done it better than anyone alive. There's a tradition in the German army, refined over more than a century, of telling a subordinate what you need achieved and then trusting him to work out how. You did not hand a junior officer a script. You handed him a purpose and let him meet it with his own judgment on the ground, in the moment, with information no headquarters miles away could possibly have. A fast, good decision was prized over a slow, perfect one. Hesitation, waiting, the failure to act when action was called for, that was treated as close to the one unforgivable sin a soldier could commit. In open warfare, this had made the German army a terror. It was the engine underneath the lightning campaigns of 1940 and 1941. By every right, this was the army best equipped on earth to improvise its way out of a broken situation. So the American achievement was not inventing the idea. It was taking an idea the Germans had kept mostly in the heads of their officers and pushing it all the way down to the bottom, into the body of every private, and then doing the dull, enormous, unglamorous work of making it whole when the men around that private started to die. Look again at how the American squad was built, not as a firing line now, but as a chain of command in miniature. At the top, the squad leader, a staff sergeant. Beneath him, an assistant squad leader, a sergeant. Not a redundancy, but a second mind already carrying the same picture. Beneath them, men who had been drilled to lead a fire team, a half squad, a handful of riflemen, if it came to that. The squad was designed to be divided. It could break into halves of 6, and those halves could break smaller still, down to pairs, down in the worst case to single men, and at each level there was meant to be someone who knew what the squad was trying to do and could keep trying to do it. This sounds like a small administrative detail. It was the difference between life and death for a unit under fire, because it meant the squad had no single irreplaceable head. When the staff sergeant fell, the sergeant was already there. When the sergeant fell, a corporal stepped up. When the corporal fell, the training said that the senior man standing took the squad, and the training had been built so that the senior man standing knew what to do. That last part is the piece people forget, and it is the piece that actually made the chain hold. It is one thing to say that a private should take over when his leaders are gone. It is another to make it true under fire, with shells coming down and men screaming and the enemy 100 yards off. The Americans made it true by an act of industrial patience that had almost nothing romantic about it. They standardized the training. Every man, in every camp, was taught the same tactics from the same manuals in the same sequence, so that a rifleman trained in Georgia and a rifleman trained in California had the same picture in his head, used the same hand signals, understood the same drills for taking a position or pulling back from one. The knowledge did not live only in the bones of a few veterans, the way it did in the German system. It lived on paper in a doctrine that had been written down and copied 1,000,000 times over, and then drilled into men until it was reflex. The consequence of that was strange and quiet and decisive. It meant that survivors who had never met could fight together immediately. A corporal who had lost his whole squad could gather 4 strangers from 3 different platoons, and because all 5 of them had been taught the same way, they could function as a unit inside minutes. There were no wasted hours learning each other's methods, because the methods were shared before any of them ever reached the line. The men were, in a sense the Germans found almost impossible to credit, interchangeable parts of a machine that had been designed to keep running while you replaced its parts under load. And the parts were being replaced under load constantly, which brings us back into the forest. Remember those numbers from the 22nd Infantry. The rifle companies that started with 162 men and stood at 87 7 days later. There's a detail buried in that figure that tells you how the machine actually worked, and it is easy to read past. Reaching even that reduced number of 87 required, on average, something like 42% replacements. Stop on that. It does not mean the company quietly shrank from 162 to 87. It means the company was bleeding men out the front the entire time, while fresh men were being pushed in the back. That the 87 were not the survivors of the original company, so much as the current state of a company that was being continuously hollowed out and continuously rebuilt, all while it kept attacking. The original company, in any real sense, was already gone. The company itself was not. It went on existing as an organism that could lose most of its cells and grow new ones without ceasing to be alive. A historian named Robert Rush spent years studying this exact regiment in this exact battle, going through the records man by man, and what he found cut against the comfortable story people like to tell about why soldiers keep fighting. It was not mostly hatred of the enemy, and it was not mostly belief in the cause. It was the unit itself, the small group, the squad, and the platoon, and the way the American system kept that small group functioning as a thing a man could belong to even as its individual members were killed and swapped out around him. The cohesion did not come from the men having known each other a long time, because very often they had not. It came from the structure. The structure was the thing that held. So now you can see all 3 pieces working at once in that gray forest. The firepower spread across the whole squad, so that a company at half strength was still throwing out a weight of rifle fire a bolt-action enemy, could not equal. The leadership spread down to the lowest ranks, so that losing every officer and most sergeants left not a leaderless mob, but a scattering of small units, each with someone able to lead it. And behind both, the pipeline, feeding new men forward in a standardized doctrine that let those new men slot in and fight without a learning period the battle would never have granted them. Cut this organism in half, and it did not die. It bled, it suffered, it lost its memory of who it had been a week ago, and it kept moving forward. I have to stop here and be honest, because the version of this story that leaves out the next part is a lie of omission, and this channel does not traffic in the tidy version. The system I have just described was not a miracle, and it did not always work. In the very same forest, in the very same weeks, American units broke. The same offensive that ground the 22nd Down had, a little earlier, fed Norman Coda's 28th Division into the trees toward a village called Schmidt, and the 28th had been mauled so badly that the experience became a byword for catastrophe. There were moments in the Hurtgen, documented in the Army's own grim records, when company commanders refused to attack, when battalions came apart and men ran, when at least one regimental commander appeared to abandon his own outfit. The resilience was a tendency, not a guarantee. It held more often than it failed, which over a long war was decisive, but it failed often enough that no one who was there would have called the men Supermen. They were not supermen. They were ordinary, frightened human beings, and some of them, under enough pressure, did exactly what frightened human beings do. And the machine that kept the companies alive had a cost written into it that fell on individuals, one at a time, in the dark. The same flow of replacements that kept the company from vanishing also meant that a single new man, trained in another country and shipped across an ocean, was often sent forward alone or in a small clutch of strangers and dropped into a veteran company at night, among men who did not know his name and had learned the hard way not to want to. His odds in those first days were appalling, precisely because the thing that made the company durable, its ability to absorb him as an interchangeable part, also stripped him of the one protection that mattered most, which was a squad that already knew him and would look out for him. The durability of the unit and the loneliness of the replacement were the same facts seen from two sides. The Hurtgen alone cost the Americans something on the order of 24,000 casualties, and thousands more men who were not hit by anything at all, but simply broke, going down with trench foot and frostbite, and the particular exhaustion of a forest where the artillery burst in the treetops and rained steel and splintered would straight down onto men who had nowhere to hide. None of that was clean. None of it was cheap. But it answers the question we started with, the one the German officers in their command posts kept circling and could not close. They were not baffled because the Americans were braver, because the Americans were not, on the whole, braver. They were baffled because they were applying a model of how a unit dies, and the model did not fit the thing in front of them. The German way of breaking an enemy was to find the heart and stop it, silence the machine gun, and the German squad around it lost most of its killing power because the power had been concentrated there on purpose. Kill the officer who carried the plan, and a unit trained to wait on that officer slowed and stalled. This worked against most enemies because most armies, including in many ways their own, had their strength gathered into a few critical points. The Americans had done the opposite. They had taken the strength of the squad, both its firepower and its authority, and they had smeared it across every man in the formation. There was no heart to find. You could cut an American company anywhere, and the cut closed because the function you were trying to destroy was not sitting in any one place where a bullet or a shell could reach it. The deepest irony, the one that should have been unbearable to the German command, is that the leadership half of this was their own invention turned against them. They had taught the world that you win by trusting the man on the spot. The Americans had simply trusted more men all the way down and had done the patient industrial work of making that trust survive the destruction of the chain above it. And by the end of 1944, the German army was no longer even the army that had perfected the idea. Its irreplaceable core of long-service veterans had been consumed in Russia and in Normandy, and the formations being thrown together to plug the gaps were filled with hastily trained men whose squads, built as ever around a machine gun and a few skilled hands, came apart in exactly the way their own doctrine predicted any cut-up squad should. They were watching their own theory of unit death prove itself on their own units, while the enemy they had been taught to dismiss kept walking forward through fire that should have finished anyone. Go back, at the end, to the 16th of November, and to Charles Lanham's regiment wading the Retere way into the trees. By the time it was relieved 18 days later, it had taken its shattered village, Grosshaw, and its 6,000 yards of forest at a price of roughly 1 man for every 2 yards, and it had lost, in total, something near to the entire strength it began with. Its rifle companies had been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. The men who walked out of the Hurtgen at the end were, most of them, not the men who had walked in. And the thing that had carried that regiment through, the thing the German officers could not name from their side of the line, was never courage alone and never a secret weapon. It was a design, a squad built so that its fire came from everywhere instead of one place. A chain of command built so that authority ran all the way down to the last private standing. A system patient enough to write all of it on paper and drill it into ordinary men until it held under the worst pressure a forest could produce. The Germans kept looking for the heart of the thing so they could stop it. There was no single heart to stop. There were only thousands of ordinary men, each one carrying a piece of the whole, going forward 2 yards at a time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.